Hey family, what I want to do on today's video is I want to address the 10 common objections that people tend to have against polygyny, particularly biblical polygamy. That is the practice of a man having multiple women. And the reason why I want to address these is because they are often used to refute or to buff against just the idea of this biblical practice and lifestyle. And what I want to do is I want to dig into the word today. I want to give some facts, a little bit of data, and I want to dig into these objections because I want to reveal, or I want to expose, God's perspective on biblical polygamy or polygyny. That is, man having the practice and the lifestyle of having multiple wives. Don't forget to like this video if you like it. Click subscribe, click notifications for future contents, and don't forget to share it with a friend. The third objection that people commonly have is that it dehumanizes women. Now, this is one of those objections that, definitely comes from the modern day movement, particularly the modern day movement of feminism that has arisen here in the Western culture. And this idea that it belittles women, it devalues women. I think in the first point when I brought out about how Moses, in the very next chapter after he writes, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," he gives the example of a slave girl, a slave woman who is now brought into this practice of polygyny. And he talks about how, or he implies that she has value given to her by God, and that value must be maintained if she is put into this lifestyle. That means that her marital rights, her dignity is protected, her food is to be or her sustenance is to be maintained, that she's not to be neglected, she's not to be abandoned, she's not to be abused, she's to be considered, okay? She's not to be used. So this woman has value according to Moses and what he wrote in Exodus, the 21st chapter, from the 7th to the 11th verse. So this idea of that polygyny somehow dehumanizes women, to the contrary, if we look at the stats, if we look at the statistics today, first and foremost, there's about 340 million Americans. And out of 340 million Americans, there is definitely a larger percentage of women to men, meaning that there are more women here in America than there are men. When we look at the prison numbers and the prison statistics, that clearly there are far more men that are percentage-wise who are going to jail as opposed to women, or being convicted and are in jail as opposed to women. We also know that in terms of the divorce rate is upwards to about 70%. So that means 7 out of 10 marriages, if you include particularly those from within religion or in the church for that matter, are getting divorced, and at record numbers. It is bananas how it is such an unsuccessful lifestyle. I think one of the brothers or the pastors that I love to follow his work here on YouTube is Pastor Dowell in Straightway Ministry. And there's a point that he uses about the percentage or the likelihood of using a parachute. If you were to jump out of a parachute, if you was to use a parachute to jump out of an airplane, and you were told that you was only going to have a 30% chance or a 70% chance that parachute was not going to open, would you jump out that plane that day? Would you take that parachute and jump out of the plane if you knew that it was a 70% chance it wasn't going to open up? I mean, if it was a 70% chance that if you was to have an operation and that you wasn't going to make it out of the operation, would you take those odds? Would you undergo that knife? Would you allow that doctor to perform surgery on you if you had a 70% chance you were not going to make it? Well, that is the statistic for marriage. we are claiming here in this society that polygyny is evil, is sin, but the practice of monogamy only, or prescriptive monogamy, is the best way. What we're claiming here is that it is successful. We're claiming that it is good. We're claiming that it is something that God has established. We're claiming that this is something that does not dehumanize women. But what dehumanizes women more than to get into a marital situation that has more of a likely chance that does not work? Think of the heartache. Think of the pain. Think of the devastation of being married to someone that you believe you're going to spend the rest of your life with, only to know that it's not going to work, or find out that it's not going to work down the road. So the fact of saying that polygyny in and of itself dehumanizes women, that is a misstatement, because most cultures that actually practice polygyny tend to have a high marital rate and a low divorce rate. Unlike here in the West, particularly here in America, there is a high divorce rate and a low marital rate. Yeah, many men are not marrying. They're checking out of the idea of marrying because they do not want to get into the situation of what they will be up against with the system is concerned. And so they're not looking to settle down under a state marriage license system where they're going to lose half of their money. The courts are going to tell them who if they'll have access to their children, or when can they have access to can they have access to their home, to their money, and on and on and on and on. And men do not any longer want to subject themselves to that kind of oppression. So the idea that says that polygyny somehow dehumanizes women, I don't know where people are getting their facts from, but clearly the facts, if you look at them, they show otherwise. The fourth issue that people tend to have that is an objection against polygyny, or the practice of biblical polygamy, it is that it causes women to be jealous. Now, here it is. Probably most of you who are looking at this video, you are an adult. And as adults, we know there's practically nowhere that you can go in this life that you're not going to find the emotion, or the human emotion, of jealousy. Jealousy is for all that matter, is a human emotion that is tied to one being possessive, and I many times it is an emotion that an individual exudes that is misappropriated or perverted, for that matter. It is the feeling of wanting exclusivity. It is the possession of desiring what belongs to oneself. It is a desire that one has, or of something that belongs to someone else that they desire for themselves. And so when I talk about jealousy, I'm talking about it in the sense of jealousy / envy, because the words are interchangeable. They're even interchangeable within the Bible. And so with jealousy, jealousy is one of those emotions that in scripture it is good, and then there is the jealousy that is evil. There is the jealousy where God talks about how he is a jealous God in Exodus, the 34th chapter, and how his name is jealous, because he is a jealous God, and what he is jealous towards us in our worship, meaning that he desires that we worship him and worship him alone and no other God. And when we do put other things before him, then it stimulates and it arouses the jealousies that he has as being our husband, and as being our creator, as being our father. And so it would be the same jealousy in that sense when a father sees his child runs to another man and embraces him as father, and rejects the biological father in that regard. That biological father will feel a sense of jealousy, and rightfully so. So that is, in a good sense, the word jealousy. Another sense of the word is when a husband's wife, from a biblical perspective, runs into the arms of another man. there is a sense of jealousy that Scripture addresses. In fact, the scripture that comes to my mind is a scripture that's found in Numbers, the 5th chapter, and that is the spirit of jealousy that a husband rightfully has concerning his wife, who he thinks has committed adultery. That is, she sleeps with another man. And in that particular chapter, what Moses addresses is that there is a particular prescribed ritual that he can undergo through the priest to determine whether if this wife of his has actually committed adultery, if he has not physically caught her in the act of adultery. And so what Moses is writing gives us the assumption that it is rightfully so for a husband to feel a sense of jealousy when his wife is into the arms or has sex with another man. But on the flip side, what Moses also wrote in Genesis, the 30th chapter, he gives us the idea of Jacob's 2 of his 4 wives, who one becomes jealous of the other. In this case, Leah becomes jealous of her sister wife, Rachel, because Jacob's devotion or his desire is more preferred towards Rachel. And so she has a sense of jealousy over her sister. So there's this sense of rivalry that Leah has towards her. But when Moses writes, he writes it in the context that it was a wrong, unjust emotion that Leah has. In other words, letting us know that just as with God, God is right and just to feel a sense of jealousy if we go worship another God. But it is wrong for us to be jealous for God to have other servants whom he loves. And that is the picture that the scripture gives us concerning biblical marriage or biblical polygyny. It is the man reflecting the image of God in the relationship, and is the woman that is reflecting the church or God's people for that matter. And that's why a man having multiple wives is reflective of us and having fellow worshipers of God, brothers and sisters that are in his congregation. We collectively worship God together. We're not to be jealous of one another when we see one having an experience with God or seeing God blessing another one of our members that are in his church. We should not be jealous of them. And equally so, women who are within a polygynous construct and context should not be jealous of one another. And even women particularly should not be jealous of one another, meaning that the jealousy of a woman over another woman is not only is it not scripturally based, but it comes from a place of perversion. And that is the point that I'm making concerning this. The fifth objection that people commonly use is that polygyny is based on men's selfish greed or his lusts. Polygyny is based on a man's selfish greed or a man's lust. This is another one of those facts that I disproved in my previous series, and that is that God designed men to have a desire for multiple women. But I want to first address really what this unjust or this ungodly greed or lust is. In Galatians, the 5th chapter, we learn in the 16th verse that there are 2 kinds of lust in the Bible. There is the flesh, there is the sinful nature of a human being that always is contrary and fights against the lusts of the Spirit of God. So in one sense, you have this perverted evil lust, but then in another sense, you have this godly, holy lust. So that lets us know that there are more than one kind of lust. There is a good lust, and then there is a bad lust. And so one can be captivated or moved or operate under a perverted lust, and one can also operate under a godly lust or a godly desire. So the question is that when it comes to the subject of polygyny, is it a godly desire or is it an ungodly desire? Well, Solomon didn't think that it was an ungodly desire, the man who actually had 1,000 wives. In Ecclesiastes, the 2nd chapter and the 8th verse, he reveals something here. He says, I, talk about in his his reign as a king of Israel who was anointed by God, he said, I amass silver and gold for myself, because God enabled him to do so. He says, and the treasure of kings and provinces. He says, I gathered male and female singers for myself, and many concubines, the delights of men, or the delights of men is to have many concubines. So Solomon understood something here. He understood that it was an ordinary delight of the sons or young men to have, and that is to have many women or many concubines. That is a desire that men have. He himself had it. Not only did he himself had it, his father had it, because his father David had about 18 wives. And so if we're going to say that Solomon was greedy, then we have to say that Abraham was greedy, David was greedy, Moses was greedy. And we have to go on. We have to say all those men, many of those men who wrote the Bible, many of those prophets of the Bible were greedy. And if they were greedy, then they were guilty of one of the abominable sins, and it disqualified them for being prophets, and it definitely disqualified them from writing scripture. The other thing is, in Moses write in Deuteronomy, the 21st chapter, the 10th to the 14th verse, is in his instructions concerning the Israelite men, or provision for that matter, of bringing captive women in war back home as wives. And one thing that he says in terms of that provision is that if you see a beautiful woman amongst the captives and you desire her for yourself, implying that Moses did not have an issue with the men in Israel on a general level wanting a woman for themselves based on her beauty. So I encourage you, go check that out. Don't take my word for it. Deuteronomy, the 21st chapter, the 10th to the 14th verse, that Moses wrote that it was a normal thing for a man in Israel to desire a woman based on how she looked, her outer appearances. And if you look up that Hebrew word, that would include her form, her figure, her body. If her body is banging, you can desire her based on her outer appearance.